Chapter 21 of Japan, an attempted interpretation by Lafcadio Hearn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Official education. The extent to which national character has been fixed by the discipline of centuries, and the extent, or its extraordinary capacity to resist change, is perhaps most strikingly indicated by certain results of state education. The whole nation is being educated, with government help, upon a European plan, and the full program includes the chief subjects of Western study, excepting Greek and Latin classics. From kindergarten to university, the entire system is modern in outward seeming. Yet the effect of the new education is much less marked in thought and sentiment than might be supposed. This fact is not to be explained merely by the large place which old Chinese study still occupies in the obligatory program, nor by differences of belief. It is much more due to the fundamental difference in the Japanese and the European conceptions of education as means to an end. In spite of new system and program, the whole of Japanese education is still conducted upon a traditional plan, almost the exact opposite of the Western plan. With us, the repressive part of moral training begins in early childhood. The European or American teacher is strict with the little ones. We think that it is important to inculcate the duties of behavior, the must and the must not of individual obligation, as soon as possible. Later on, more liberty is allowed. The well-grown boy is made to understand that his future will depend upon his personal effort and capacity, and he is thereafter left, in a great measure, to take care of himself, being occasionally admonished or warned, as seems needful. Finally, the adult student of promise and character may become the intimate or, under happy circumstances, even the friend of his tutor, to whom he can look for counsel in all difficult situations. And throughout the whole course of mental and moral training, competition is not only expected, but required. But it is more and more required as discipline is more and more relaxed, with the passing of boyhood into manhood. The aim of Western education is the cultivation of individual ability and personal character, the creation of an independent and forceful being. Now, Japanese education has always been conducted and, in spite of superficial appearances, is still being conducted, mostly upon the reverse plan. Its object never has been to train the individual for independent action, but to train him for cooperative action, to fit him to occupy an exact place in the mechanism of a rigid society. Constraint among ourselves begins with childhood and gradually relaxes. Constraint in Far Eastern training begins later, and thereafter gradually tightens. And it is not a constraint imposed directly by parents or teachers, which fact, as we shall presently see, makes an enormous difference in results. Not merely up to the age of school life, supposed to begin at 6 years, but considerably beyond it, a Japanese child enjoys a degree of liberty far greater than is allowed to Occidental children. Exceptional cases are common, of course, but the general rule is that the child be permitted to do as he pleases, providing that his conduct can cause no injury to himself or to others. He is guarded, but not constrained, admonished, but rarely compelled. In short, he is allowed to be so mischievous that, as a Japanese proverb says, even the holes by the roadside hate a boy of 7 or 8 years old. Note: by former custom a newly born child was said to be 1 year old, and in this case the words 7 or 8 years old mean 6 or 7 years old. End of note. Nanatsu, yatsu. Michibata no ana de saimon nikomu. Punishment is administered only when absolutely necessary, and on such occasions, by ancient custom, the entire household, servants and all, intercede for the offender. The little brothers and sisters, if any there be, begging in turn to bear the penalty instead. Whipping is not a common punishment, except among the roughest classes. The moxa is preferred as a deterrent, and it is a severe one. To frighten a child by loud, harsh words or angry looks is condemned by general opinion. All punishment ought to be inflicted as quietly as possible, the punisher calmly admonishing the while. To slap a child about the head for any reason is a proof of vulgarity and ignorance. It is not customary to punish by restraining from play, or by a change of diet, or by any denial of accustomed pleasures. To be perfectly patient with children is the ethical law. At school the discipline begins, but it is at first so very light that it can hardly be called discipline. The teacher does not act as a master, but rather as an elder brother, and there is no punishment beyond a public admonition. Whatever restraint exists is chiefly exerted on a child by the common opinion of his class, and a skilful teacher is able to direct that opinion. Also, each class is nominally governed by one or two little captains, selected for character and intelligence, and when a disagreeable order has to be given, it is the child captain, the kyucho, who is commissioned with the duty of giving it. These little details are worthy of note. I cite them only to show how early in school life begins the discipline of opinion, the pressure of the common will, and how perfectly this policy accords with the ethical traditions of the race. In higher classes the pressure slightly increases, and in higher schools it is very much stronger, the ruling power always being class sentiment, not the individual will of the teacher. In middle schools the pupils become serious. Class opinion there attains a force to which the teacher himself must bend, as it is quite capable of expelling him for any attempt to override it. Each middle school class has its elected officers, who represent and enforce the moral code of the majority, the traditional standard of conduct. This moral standard is deteriorating, but it survives everywhere to some degree. Fighting or bullying are yet unknown in Japanese schools of this grade for obvious reasons. There can be little indulgence of personal anger, and no attempt at personal domination under discipline enforcing a uniform manner of behavior. It is never the domination of the one over the many that regulates class life. It is always the rule of the many over the one, and the power is formidable. The student who consciously or unconsciously offends class sentiment will suddenly find himself isolated, condemned to absolute solitude. No one will speak to him or notice him, even outside of the school, until such time as he decides to make a public apology, when his pardon will depend upon a majority vote. Such temporary ostracism is not unreasonably feared, because it is regarded even outside of student circles as a disgrace, and the memory of it will cling to the offender during the rest of his career. However high he may rise in official or professional life in after years, the fact that he was once condemned by the general opinion of his schoolmates will not be forgotten, though circumstances may occur which will turn the fact to his credit. In the great government schools, to one of which the student may proceed after graduating from a middle school, class discipline is still more severe. The instructors are mostly officials looking for promotion. The students are grown men, preparing for the university and destined, with few exceptions, for public office. In this quietly and coldly ordered world there is little place for the joy of youth, and small opportunity for sympathetic expansion. There are gatherings and societies, but these are arranged or established for practical purposes, chiefly in relation to particular branches of study. There is little time for merrymaking, and less inclination. Under all circumstances a certain formal demeanour is exacted by tradition, a tradition older by far than any public school. Everybody watches everybody. Eccentricities or singularities are quickly marked and quietly suppressed. The results of this class discipline, as maintained in some institutions, must seem to the foreign observer discomforting. What most impressed me about these higher official schools was the sinister silence of them. In one where I taught for several years, the most conservative school in the country, there were more than 1,000 young men full of life and energy. Yet, during the intervals between classes or during recreation hours in the playground, the garden, and the gymnastic hall, the general hush gave one a strange sense of oppression. One might watch a game of football being played and hear nothing but the thud of the kicking, or one might watch wrestling contests in a jiu-jitsu room and hear no word spoken for half an hour at a time. The rules of jiu-jitsu, it is true, require not only silence, but the total suppression of all visible emotional interest on the part of the spectators. All this repression at first seemed to me very strange, though I knew that 30 years previously the training at samurai schools compelled the same impassiveness and reticence. At last the university is reached, the great gate of ceremony to public office. Here the student finds himself released from the restraints previously imposed upon his private life, though the class will continues to rule him in certain directions. Note, this release is of recent date, and the results by the acknowledgement of the students themselves have not been good. 25 years ago, university study was so seriously thought about that a scholar who failed through his own fault would have been considered a criminal. There was then a Chinese poem in vogue which used to be sung at the departure of youths for the university of that time, Daigak Nanko, by their friends and relations. Danji kokorosashi. Danji kokorosashi o tatate, kyokwan o itsu. Kakumoshi narasunba, shisudomo kairatsu. The young man, having made a firm resolve, leaves his native home. If he fail to acquire learning, then, even though he die, he must never return. In those years also it was obligatory upon students to live and dress simply, and to abstain from all self-indulgence. End of note. As a rule, the student passes into official life after having graduated, marries, and becomes the head or the prospective head of a household. How sudden the transformation of the man at this epoch of his career! Only those who have observed the transformation can imagine. It is then that the full significance of Japanese education reveals itself. Few incidents of Japanese life are more surprising than the metamorphosis of the gawky student into the dignified, impassive, easy-mannered official. But a little time ago he was respectfully asking, cap in hand, the explanation of some text, the meaning of some foreign idiom. Today, perhaps, he is judging cases in some court, or managing diplomatic correspondence under ministerial supervision, or directing the management of some public school. Whatever you may have thought of his particular capacity as a student, you will scarcely doubt his particular fitness for the position to which he has been called. Success in study was at best a secondary consideration in the matter of his appointment, though he had to succeed. He was put through some special course, under high protection, after having been selected for certain qualities of character, or, at least, for the promise of such qualities. There may have been favoritism in his case, but, generally speaking, capable men are appointed to positions of trust. The government seldom makes serious mistakes. This man has value beyond what mere study could make for him, some capacity in the direction of management or of organization, some natural force or talent which his training has served to cultivate. According to the quality of his worth, his position was chosen for him in advance. His long, hard schooling has taught him more than books can teach, and more than a stupid person can ever learn. How to read minds and motives, how to remain impassive under all circumstances, how to reach a truth quickly by simple questioning, how to live upon his guard, even against the most intimate of old acquaintances, how to remain, even when most amiable, secretive and inscrutable. He has graduated in the art of worldly wisdom. He is really a wonderful person, a highly developed type of his race, and no inexperienced Occidental is capable of judging him, because his visible acquirements count for very little in the measure of his relative value. His university study, his English or French or German knowledge, serves him only as so much oil to make easy the working of certain official machinery. He esteems this learning only as means to some administrative end. His real learning, considerably deeper, represents the development of the Japanese soul of him. Between that mind and any Western mind, the distance has become immeasurable. And now, less than ever before, does he belong to himself. He belongs to a family, to a party, to a government. Privately he is bound by custom. Publicly he must act according to order only, and never dream of yielding to any impulses at variance with order, however generous or sensible such impulses may be. A word might ruin him. He has learned to use no words unnecessarily. By silent submission and tireless observance of duty he may rise, and rise quickly. He may become governor, chief justice, minister of state, minister plenipotentiary, but the higher he rises, the heavier will his bonds become. Long training in caution and self-control is indeed an indispensable preparation for official existence. The ability either to keep a position won or to resign it with honor, depending much upon such training. The most sinister circumstance of official life is the absence of moral freedom, the absence of the right to act according to one's own convictions of justice. The subordinate who desires above all things to keep his place is not supposed to have personal convictions or sympathies, save by permission. He is not the slave of a man, but of a system as old as China. Were human nature perfect, that system would be perfect, but so long as human nature remains what it is now, the system leaves much to be desired. Everything may depend upon the personal character of those temporarily entrusted with higher power, and the only choice left for the most capable servant under a bad master may be to resign or to do wrong. The strong man faces the problem bravely and resigns, but for one strong man there are 50 timid ones. Probably the prospect of a broken career is much less terrifying than the ancient idea of crime attaching to any form of insubordination. As the forms of a religion survive after the faith in doctrine has passed away, so the power of government to coerce even conscience still remains, though religion is no longer identified with government. The system of secrecy, implacably enforced, helps to maintain the vague awe that has always attached to the idea of administrative authority. And such authority is practically omnipotent within those limits which I have already indicated. To be favored by authority means to experience all the elusive pleasure of a suddenly created popularity. An entire community, a whole city, is made by a word to turn all the amiable side of its human nature toward the favorite, to charm him into the belief that he is worthy of the best that the world can give him. But suppose that the moving powers happen, later on, to find the favored man in the way of some policy. Lo, at another whispered word he finds himself, without knowing why, the public enemy. None speak to him or salute him or smile upon him, save ironically. Long esteemed friends pass him by without recognition, or, if pursued, reply to his most earnest questions with all possible brevity and caution. Most likely they do not know the why of the matter. They only know that orders have been given, and that into the reason of orders it is not good to inquire. Even the street children know this much, and mock the despondent victim of fortune, Even the dogs seem instinctively to divine the change and bark at him as he passes by. Such is the power of official displeasure, and the penalty of a blunder or a breach of discipline may extend considerably further, but in feudal times the offender would have been simply told to perform harakiri. Sometimes when the wrong man gets into power, the force of authority may be used for malevolent ends, and in such event it requires not a little courage to disobey an order to act against conscience. What saved Japanese society in former ages from the worst results of this form of tyranny was the moral sentiment of the mass, the common feeling that underlay all submission to authority, and remained always capable, if pressed upon too brutally, of compelling a reaction. Conditions today are more favorable to justice, but it requires much tact, steadiness, and resolution on the part of a rising official to steer himself safely among the reefs and the whirlpools of the new political life. The reader will now be able to understand the general character, aim, and results of official education as a system. It will be also worth while to consider in detail certain phases of student life, which equally prove the survival of old conditions and old traditions. I can speak about these matters from personal experience as a teacher, an experience extending over nearly 13 years. Readers of Goethe will remember the trustful docility of the student received by Dr. Mephistopheles in the first part of Faust, and the very different demeanour of the same student when he reappears in the second part as Baccalaureus. More than one foreign professor in Japan must have been reminded of that contrast by personal experience, and must have wondered whether some one of the early educational advisers to the Japanese government did not play, without malice prepense, the very role of Mephistopheles. The gentle boy who, with innocent reverence, makes his visit of courtesy to the foreign teacher, bringing for gift a cluster of iris flowers or odorous spray of plum blossoms. The boy who does whatever he is told, and charms by an earnestness, a trustfulness, a grace of manner rarely met with among Western lads of the same age, is destined to undergo the strangest of transformations long before becoming a baccalaureus. You may meet with him a few years later in the uniform of some higher school, and find it difficult to recognize your former pupil, now graceless, taciturn, secretive, and inclined to demand as a right what could scarcely, with propriety, be requested as a favour. You may find him patronizing, possibly something worse. Later on, at the university, he becomes more formally correct, but also more far away, so very far away from his boyhood that the remoteness is a pain to one who remembers that boyhood. The Pacific is less wide and deep than the invisible gulf now extending between the mind of the stranger and the mind of the student. The foreign professor is now regarded merely as a teaching machine, and is more than likely to regret any effort made to maintain an intimate relation with his pupils. Indeed, the whole formal system of official education is opposed to the development of any such relation. I am speaking of general facts in this connection, not of merely personal experiences. No matter what the foreigner may do in the hope of finding his way into touch with the emotional life of his students, or in the hope of evoking that interest in certain studies which renders possible an intellectual tie, he must toil in vain. Perhaps in 2 or 3 cases out of 1,000 he may obtain something precious, a lasting and kindly esteem, based upon moral comprehension. But should he wish for more, he must remain in the state of the Antarctic explorer, seeking, month after month, to no purpose, some inlet through endless cliffs of everlasting ice. Now the case of the Japanese professor proves the barrier natural to a large extent. The Japanese professor can ask for extraordinary efforts and obtain them. He can afford to be easily familiar with his students outside of class, and he can get what no stranger can obtain, their devotion. The difference has been attributed to race feeling, but it cannot be so easily and vaguely explained. Something of race sentiment there certainly is. It were impossible that there should not be. No inexperienced foreigner can converse for 1/2 hour with any Japanese, at least with any Japanese who has not sojourned abroad, and avoid saying something that jars upon Japanese good taste or sentiment, and few, perhaps none, among untravelled Japanese can maintain a brief conversation in any European tongue without making some startling impression upon the foreign listener. Sympathetic understanding between minds so differently constructed is next to impossible, but the foreign professor who looks for the impossible, who expects from Japanese students the same quality of intelligent comprehension that he might reasonably expect from Western students, is naturally disturbed. Why must there always remain the width of a world between us, is a question often asked, and rarely answered. Some of the reasons should by this time be obvious to my reader, but one among them, and the most curious, will not. Before stating it, I must observe that while the relation between foreign instructor and the Japanese student is artificial, that between the Japanese teacher and the student is traditionally one of sacrifice and obligation. The inertia encountered by the stranger, the indifference which chills him at all times, are due in great part to the misapprehension arising from totally opposite conceptions of duty. Old sentiment lingers long after old forms have passed away, and how much of feudal Japan survives in modern Japan no stranger can readily divine. Probably the bulk of existing sentiment is hereditary sentiment. The ancient ideals have not yet been replaced by fresh ones. In feudal times the teacher taught without salary. He was expected to devote all his time, thought, and strength to his profession. High honor was attached to that profession, and the matter of remuneration was not discussed. The instructor trusting wholly to the gratitude of parents and pupils. Public sentiment bound them to him with a bond that could not be broken. Therefore a general, upon the eve of an assault, would take care that his former teacher should have an opportunity to escape from the place beleaguered. The tie between teacher and pupil was in force second only to the tie between parent and child. The teacher sacrificed everything for his pupil. The pupil was ready at all times to die for his teacher. Now, indeed, the hard and selfish aspects of Japanese character are coming to the surface. But a single fact will sufficiently indicate how much of the old ethical sentiments persists under the new and rougher surface. Nearly all the higher educational work accomplished in Japan represents, though aided by government, the results of personal sacrifice. From the summit of society to the base, this sacrificial spirit rules. That a large part of the private income of their imperial majesties has for many years been devoted to public education is well known, but that every person of rank or wealth or high position educates students at his private expense is not generally known. In the majority of cases this help is entirely gratuitous. In a minority of cases the expenses of the student are advanced only, to be repaid by installments at some future time. The reader is doubtless aware that the daimyo in former times used to dispose of the bulk of their incomes in supporting and helping their retainers, supplying hundreds, in some cases thousands, and in some few cases even tens of thousands of persons with the necessaries of life, and exacting in return military service, loyalty, and obedience. Those former daimyo, or their successors, particularly those who are still large landholders, now vie with each other in assisting education. All who can afford it are educating sons or grandsons or descendants of former retainers. The subjects of this patronage being annually selected from among the students of schools established in the former daimiates. It is only the rich noble who can now support a number of students gratuitously, year after year. The poorer man of rank cannot care for many, but all, or very nearly all, maintain some. And this even in cases where the patron's income is so small that the expense could not be borne unless the student were pledged to repay it after graduation. In some instances, half of the cost is borne by the patron, the student being required to repay the rest. Now, these aristocratic examples are extensively followed through other grades of society. Merchants, bankers, and manufacturers, all rich men of the commercial and industrial classes, are educating students. Military officers, civil service officials, physicians, lawyers, men of every profession in short, are doing the same thing. Persons whose incomes are too small to permit of such generosity are able to help students by employing them as doorkeepers, messengers, tutors, giving them board and lodging, and a little pocket money at times, in return for light services. In Tokyo and in most of the large cities, almost every large house is guarded by students who are being thus assisted. As for what the teachers do, that requires special mention. The majority of teachers in the public schools do not receive salaries enabling them to help students with money, but all teachers earning more than the bare necessary give aid of some sort. Among the instructors and professors of the higher educational establishments, the helping of students seems to be thought of as a matter of course, so much a matter of course that we might suspect a new tyranny of custom, especially in view of the smallness of official salaries. But no tyranny of custom would explain the pleasure of sacrifice and the strange persistence of feudal idealism, which are revealed by some extraordinary facts. For example, a certain university professor is known to have supported and educated a large number of students by dividing among them, during many years, nearly the whole of his salary. He lodged, clothed, boarded and educated them, bought their books and paid their fees, reserving for himself only the cost of his living, and reducing even that cost by living upon hot, sweet potatoes. Fancy a foreign professor in Japan putting himself upon a diet of bread and water for the purpose of educating, gratuitously, a number of poor young men. I know of 2 other cases nearly as remarkable. The helper, in one instance, being an old man of more than 70, who still devotes all his means, time, and knowledge to his ancient ideal of duty. How much obscure sacrifice of this kind has been performed by those least able to afford it never will be known. Indeed, the publication of the facts would only give pain. I am guilty of some indiscretion in mentioning even a case brought to my attention, though human nature is honored by the mention. Now it should be evident that while Japanese students are accustomed to witness self-denial of this sort on the part of native professors, they cannot be much impressed by any manifestation of interest or sympathy on the part of the foreign professor, who, though receiving a higher salary than his Japanese colleagues, has no reason and small inclination to imitate their example. Surely, this heroic fact of education sustained by personal sacrifices in the face of unimaginable difficulties is enough to redeem much humbug and wrong. In spite of the corruption which has been of late years rife in educational circles, in spite of official scandals, intrigues, and shams, all needed reforms can be hoped for while the spirit of generous self-denial continues to rule the world of teachers and students. I can venture also the opinion that most of the official scandals and failures have resulted from the interference of politics with modern education, or from attempting to imitate foreign conventional methods, totally at variance with national moral experience. Where Japan has remained true to her old moral ideals, she has done nobly and well. Where she has needlessly departed from them, sorrow and trouble have been the natural consequences. There are yet other facts in modern education suggesting even more forcibly how much of the old life remains hidden under the new conditions, and how rigidly race character has become fixed in the higher types of mind. I refer chiefly to the results of Japanese education abroad, a higher special training in German, English, French, or American universities. In some directions these results, to foreign observation at least, appear to be almost negative, considering the immense psychological differentiation, the total oppositeness of mental structure and habit. It is astonishing that Japanese students have been able to do what they actually have done at foreign universities, to graduate at any European or American university of mark with a mind shaped by Japanese culture, filled with Chinese learning, crammed with ideographs, is a prodigious feat. Scarcely less of a feat than it would be for an American student to graduate at a Chinese university. Certainly the men sent abroad to study are carefully selected for ability, and one indispensable requisite for the mission is a power of memory incomparably superior to the average Occidental memory, and different altogether as to quality. A memory for details. Nevertheless, the feat is amazing. But with the return to Japan of these young scholars, there is commonly an end of effort in the direction of the speciality studied, unless it happens to have been a purely practical subject. Does this signify incapacity for independent work upon Occidental lines? Incapacity for creative thought? Lack of constructive imagination? Disinclination or indifference? The history of that terrible mental and moral discipline to which the race was so long subjected would certainly suggest such limitations in the modern Japanese mind. Perhaps these questions cannot yet be answered, except, I imagine, as regards the indifference, which is self-evident and undisguised. But, independently of any question of capacity or inclination, there is this fact to be considered, that proper encouragement has not yet been given to home scholarship. The plain truth is that young men are sent to foreign seats of learning for other ends than to learn how to devote the rest of their lives to the study of psychology, philology, literature, or modern philosophy. They are sent abroad to fit them for higher posts in government service, and their foreign study is but one obligatory episode in their official career. Each has to qualify himself for special duty by learning how Western people study and think and feel in certain directions, and by ascertaining the range of educational progress in those directions. But he is not ordered to think or to feel like Western people, which would, in any event, be impossible for him. He has not, and probably could not have, any deep personal interest in Western learning outside of the domain of applied science. His business is to learn how to understand such matters from the Japanese, not from the Occidental point of view. But he performs his part well, does exactly what he has been told to do, and rarely anything more. His value to his government is doubled or quadrupled by his allotted experience. But at home, except during a few years of expected duty as professor or lecturer, he will probably use that experience only as a psychological costume of ceremony, a mental uniform to be donned when official occasion may require. It is otherwise in the case of men sent abroad for scientific studies, requiring not only intelligence and memory, but natural quickness of hands and eye, surgery, medicine, military specialities. I doubt whether the average efficiency of Japanese surgeons can be surpassed. The study of war, I need hardly say, is one for which the national mind and character have inherited aptitude. But men sent abroad merely to win a foreign university degree, and destined, after a term of educational duty, to higher official life, appear to set small value upon their foreign acquirements. However, even if they could win distinction in Europe by further effort at home, That effort would have to be made at a serious pecuniary sacrifice, and its results could not as yet be fairly appreciated by their own countrymen. Some of us have wondered at times what the old Egyptians or the old Greeks would have done if suddenly brought into dangerous contact with a civilization like our own, a civilization of applied mathematics, with sciences and branch sciences of which the mere names would fill a dictionary. I think that the history of modern Japan suggests very clearly what any wise people with a civilization based upon ancestor worship would have done. They would have speedily reconstructed their patriarchal society to meet the sudden peril. They would have adopted with astonishing success all the scientific machinery that they could use. They would have created a formidable army and a highly efficient navy. They would have sent the young aristocrats abroad to study alien convention and to qualify for diplomatic duty. They would have established a new system of education and obliged all their children to study many new things. But toward the higher emotional and intellectual life of that alien civilization, they would naturally exhibit indifference. Its best literature, its philosophy, its broader forms of tolerant religion could make no profound appeal to their moral and social experience. End of chapter 21. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 22 of Japan, an attempted interpretation by Lafcadio Hearn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Industrial danger. Everywhere, the course of human civilization has been shaped by the same evolutionary law, and as the earlier history of the ancient European communities can help us to understand the social conditions of old Japan, so a later period of the same history can help us to divine something of the probable future of the new Japan. It has been shown by the author of La Cite Antique that the history of all the ancient Greek and Latin communities included 4 revolutionary periods. Note: not excepting Sparta. The Spartan society was evolutionally much in advance of the Ionian societies, the Dorian patriarchal clan having been dissolved at some very early period. Sparta kept its king, but affairs of civil justice were regulated by the Senate, and affairs of criminal justice by the ephors, who also had the power to declare war and to make treaties of peace. After the first great revolution of Spartan history, the king was deprived of power in civil matters, in criminal matters, and in military matters. He retained his sacerdotal office. See, for details, La Cite Antique, pages 285 to 287. End of note. The first revolution had everywhere for its issue the withdrawal of political power from the priest-king, who was nevertheless allowed to retain the religious authority. The second revolutionary period witnessed the breaking up of the gens Greek genus, or the enfranchisement of the client from the authority of the patron, and several important changes in the legal constitution of the family. The third revolutionary period saw the weakening of the religious and military aristocracy, the entrance of the common people into the rights of citizenship, and the rise of a democracy of wealth, presently to be opposed by a democracy of poverty. The fourth revolutionary period witnessed the first bitter struggles between rich and poor, the final triumph of anarchy, and the consequent establishment of a new and horrible form of despotism, the despotism of the popular tyrant. To these 4 revolutionary periods, the social history of old Japan presents but 2 correspondences. The first Japanese revolutionary period was represented by the Fujiwara usurpation of the imperial civil and military authority, after which event the aristocracy, religious and military, really governed Japan down to our own time. All the events of the rise of the military power and the concentration of authority under the Tokugawa shogunate properly belong to the first revolutionary period. At the time of the opening of Japan, society had not evolutionarily advanced beyond a stage corresponding to that of the antique Western societies in the 7th or 8th century before Christ. The second revolutionary period really began only with the reconstruction of society in 1871, but within the space of a single generation thereafter, Japan entered upon her third revolutionary period. Already the influence of the elder aristocracy is threatened by the sudden rise of a new oligarchy of wealth, a new industrial power probably destined to become omnipotent in politics. The disintegration, now proceeding, of the clan, the changes in the legal constitution of the family, the entrance of the people into the enjoyment of political rights, must all tend to hasten the coming transfer of power. There is every indication that, in the present order of things, the third revolutionary period will run its course rapidly, and then a fourth revolutionary period, fraught with serious danger, would be in immediate prospect. Consider the bewildering rapidity of recent changes, from the reconstruction of society in 1871 to the opening of the first national parliament in 1891. Down to the middle of the 19th century the nation had remained in the condition common to European patriarchal communities 2600 years ago. Society had indeed entered upon a second period of integration, but had traversed only one great revolution, and then the country was suddenly hurried through two more social revolutions of the most extraordinary kind, signalized by the abolition of the daimyates, the suppression of the military class, the substitution of a plebeian for an aristocratic army, popular enfranchisement, the rapid formalism of a new commonalty, industrial expansion, the rise of a new aristocracy of wealth, and popular representation in government. Old Japan had never developed a wealthy and powerful middle class. She had not even approached that stage of industrial development which, in the ancient European societies, naturally brought about the first political struggles between rich and poor. Her social organization made industrial oppression impossible. The commercial classes were kept at the bottom of society, under the feet even of those who, in more highly evolved communities, are most at the mercy of money power. But now those commercial classes, set free and highly privileged, are silently and swiftly ousting the aristocratic ruling class from power, are becoming supremely important. And under the new order of things, forms of social misery, never before known in the history of the race, are being developed. Some idea of this misery may be obtained from the fact that the number of poor people in Tokyo unable to pay their annual resident tax is upwards of 50,000. Yet the amount of the tax is only about 20 sen or 5 pence English money. Prior to the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a minority, there was never any such want in any part of Japan, except, of course, as a temporary consequence of war. The early history of European civilization supplies analogies. In the Greek and Latin communities, up to the time of the dissolution of the gens, there was no poverty in the modern meaning of that word. Slavery, with some few exceptions, existed only in the mild domestic form. There were yet no commercial oligarchies, and no industrial oppressions, and the various cities and states were ruled, after political power had been taken from the early kings, by military aristocracies, which also exercised religious functions. There was yet little trade in the modern signification of the term, and money as current coinage came into circulation only in the 7th century before Christ. Misery did not exist. Under any patriarchal system based upon ancestor worship, there is no misery as a consequence of poverty, except such as may be temporarily created by devastation or famine. If want thus comes, it comes to all alike. In such a state of society everybody is in the service of somebody, and receives in exchange for service all the necessaries of life. there is no need for anyone to trouble himself about the question of living. Also, in such a patriarchal community, which is self-sufficing, there is little need of money. Barter takes the place of trade. In all these respects, the condition of old Japan offered a close parallel to the conditions of patriarchal society in ancient Europe. While the uchi or clan existed, there was no misery except as a result of war, famine, or pestilence. Throughout society, excepting the small commercial class, the need of money was rare, and such coinage as existed was little suited to general circulation. Taxes were paid in rice and other produce. As the lord nourished his retainers, so the samurai cared for his dependents, the farmer for his labourers, the artisan for his apprentices and journeymen, the merchant for his clerks. Everybody was fed, and there was no need, in ordinary times at least, for anyone to go hungry. It was only with the breaking up of the clan system in Japan that the possibilities of starvation for the worker first came into existence. And as, in antique Europe, the enfranchised clan class and plebeian class developed, under like conditions, into a democracy clamoring for suffrage and all political rights, so in Japan have the common people developed the political instinct in self-protection. It will be remembered how, in Greek and Roman society, the aristocracy founded upon religious tradition and military power had to give way to an oligarchy of wealth, and how there, subsequently, came into existence a democratic form of government. Democratic, not in the modern, but in the old Greek meaning. At a yet later day, the results of popular suffrage were the breaking up of this democratic government, and the initiation of an atrocious struggle between rich and poor. After that strife had begun, there was no more security for life or property until the Roman conquest enforced order. Now it seems not unlikely that there will be witnessed in Japan, at no very distant day, a strong tendency to repeat the history of the old Greek anarchies. With the constant increase of poverty and pressure of population, and the concomitant accumulation of wealth in the hands of a new industrial class, the peril is obvious. Thus far the nation has patiently borne all changes, relying upon the experience of its past and trusting implicitly to its rulers. But should wretchedness be so permitted to augment that the question of how to keep from starving becomes imperative for the millions, the long patience and the long trust may fail. And then, to repeat a figure effectively used by Professor Huxley, the primitive man, finding that the moral man has landed him in the valley of the shadow of death, may rise up to take the management of affairs into his own hands, and fight savagely for the right of existence. As popular instinct is not too dull to divine the first cause of this misery in the introduction of Western industrial methods, it is unpleasant to reflect what such an upheaval might signify. But nothing of moment has yet been done to ameliorate the condition of the wretched class of operatives, now estimated to exceed 500,000. Monsieur de Coulanges has pointed out that the absence of individual liberty was the real cause of the disorders and the final ruin of the Greek societies. Note: La Cite Antique, pages 400 and 401. End of note. Rome suffered less, and survived, and dominated, because within her boundaries the rights of the individual had been more respected. Now the absence of individual freedom in modern Japan would certainly appear to be nothing less than a national danger. For those very habits of unquestioning obedience and loyalty and respect for authority which made feudal society possible are likely to render a true democratic regime impossible, and would tend to bring about a state of anarchy. Only races long accustomed to personal liberty, liberty to think about matters of ethics apart from matters of government, liberty to consider questions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, independently of political authority, are able to face without risk the peril now menacing Japan. For, Should social disintegration take in Japan the same course which it followed in the old European societies, unchecked by any precautionary legislation, and so bring about another social revolution, the consequence could scarcely be less than utter ruin. In the antique world of Europe, the total disintegration of the patriarchal system occupied centuries. It was slow, and it was normal, not having been brought about by external forces. In Japan, on the contrary, this disintegration is taking place under enormous outside pressure, operating with the rapidity of electricity and steam. In Greek societies the changes were effected in about 300 years. In Japan, it is hardly more than 30 years since the patriarchal system was legally dissolved, and the industrial system reshaped. Yet already the danger of anarchy is in sight, and the population, astonishingly augmented by more than 10 millions, already begins to experience all the forms of misery developed by want under industrial conditions. It was perhaps inevitable that the greatest freedom accorded under the new order of things should have been given in the direction of greatest danger. Though the government cannot be said to have done much for any form of competition within the sphere of its own direct control, it has done even more than could have been reasonably expected on behalf of national industrial competition. Loans have been lavishly advanced, subsidies generously allowed, and, in spite of various panics and failures, the results have been prodigious. Within 30 years the value of articles manufactured for export has risen from 500,000 to 500 million yen. But this immense development has been effected at serious cost in other directions. The old methods of family production, and therefore most of the beautiful industries and arts, for which Japan has been so long famed, now seem doomed beyond hope, and instead of the ancient kindly relations between master and workers, there have been brought into existence, with no legislation to restrain inhumanity, all the horrors of factory life at its worst. The new combinations of capital have actually re-established servitude under harsher forms than ever were imagined under the feudal era. The misery of the women and children subjected to that servitude is a public scandal, and proves strange possibilities of cruelty on the part of a people once renowned for kindness even to animals. There is now a humane outcry for reform, and earnest efforts have been made and will be made to secure legislation for the protection of operatives. But, as might be expected, these efforts have been hitherto strongly opposed by manufacturing companies and syndicates, with the declaration that any government interference with factory management will greatly hamper, if not cripple, enterprise and hinder competition with foreign industry. Less than 20 years ago the very same arguments were used in England to oppose the efforts then being made to improve the condition of the industrial classes, and that opposition was challenged by Professor Huxley in a noble address, which every Japanese legislator would do well to read today. Speaking of the reforms in progress during 1888, the professor said, "If it is said that the carrying out of such arrangements as those indicated must enhance the cost of production and thus handicap the producer in the race of competition, I venture, in the first place, to doubt the fact. But, if it be so, it results that industrial society has to face a dilemma, either alternative of which threatens destruction. On the one hand, a population, the labor of which is sufficiently remunerated, may be physically and morally healthy and socially stable, but may fail in industrial competition by reason of the dearness of its produce. On the other hand, a population, the labor of which is insufficiently remunerated, must become physically and morally unhealthy and socially unstable. And though it may succeed for a while in competition by reason of the cheapness of its produce, it must in the end fall, through hideous misery and degradation, to utter ruin. Well, if these be the only alternatives, let us for ourselves and our children choose the former, and, if need be, starve like men. But I do not believe that a stable society, made up of healthy, vigorous, instructed and self-ruling people, would ever incur serious risk of that fate. They are not likely to be troubled with many competitors of the same character just yet, and they may be safely trusted to find ways of holding their own. Note: The Struggle for Existence in Human Society. Collected Essays. Volume 9, pages 113 to 219. End of note. If the future of Japan could depend upon her army and her navy, upon the high courage of her people and their readiness to die by the 100,000 for ideals of honor and of duty, there would be small cause for alarm in the present state of affairs. Unfortunately, her future must depend upon other qualities than courage, other abilities than those of sacrifice, and her struggle hereafter must be one in which her social traditions will place her at an immense disadvantage. The capacity for industrial competition cannot be made to depend upon the misery of women and children. It must depend upon the intelligent freedom of the individual. And the society which suppresses this freedom, or suffers it to be suppressed, must remain too rigid for competition with societies in which the liberties of the individual are strictly maintained. While Japan continues to think and to act by groups, even by groups of industrial companies, so long she must always continue incapable of her best. Her ancient social experience is not sufficient to avail her for the future international struggle. Rather, it must sometimes impede her as so much dead weight. Dead, in the ghostly sense of the word, the viewless pressure upon her life of numberless vanished generations. She will have not only to strive against colossal odds in her rivalry with more plastic and more forceful societies, she will have to strive much more against the power of a phantom past. Yet it were a grievous error to imagine that she has nothing further to gain from her ancestral faith. All her modern successes have been aided by it, and all her modern failures have been marked by needless breaking with its ethical custom. She could compel her people, by a simple fiat, to adopt the civilization of the West with all its pain and struggle, only because that people had been trained for ages in submission and loyalty and sacrifice, and the time has not yet come in which she can afford to cast away the whole of her moral past. More freedom indeed she requires, but freedom restrained by wisdom. Freedom to think and act and strive for self as well as for others, not freedom to oppress the weak or to exploit the simple. And the new cruelties of her industrial life can find no justification in the traditions of her ancient faith, which exacted absolute obedience from the dependent, but equally required the duty of kindness from the master. In so far as she has permitted her people to depart from the way of kindness, she herself has surely departed from the way of the gods. And the domestic future appears dark. Born of that darkness, an evil dream comes oftentimes to those who love Japan. The fear that all her efforts are being directed with desperate heroism only to prepare the land for the sojourn of peoples older by centuries in commercial experience. That her thousands of miles of railroads and telegraphs, her mines and forges, her arsenals and factories, her docks and fleets, are being put in order for the use of foreign capital. That her admirable army and her heroic navy may be doomed to make their last sacrifices in hopeless contest against some combination of greedy states, provoked or encouraged to aggression by circumstances beyond the power of government to control. But the statesmanship that has already guided Japan through many storms should prove able to cope with this gathering peril. End of chapter 22. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 23 of Japan, an attempt at interpretation by Lafcadio Hearn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reflections. In the preceding pages I have endeavored to suggest a general idea of the social history of Japan and a general idea of the nature of those forces which shaped and tempered the character of her people. Certainly this attempt leaves much to be desired. The time is yet far away at which a satisfactory work upon the subject can be prepared. But the fact that Japan can be understood only through the study of her religious and social evolution has been, I trust, sufficiently indicated. She affords us the amazing spectacle of an Eastern society maintaining all the outward forms of Western civilization, using with unquestionable efficiency the applied science of the Occident, accomplishing by a prodigious effort the work of centuries within the time of 3 decades, yet sociologically remaining at a stage corresponding to that which, in ancient Europe, preceded the Christian era by hundreds of years. But no suggestion of origins and causes should diminish the pleasure of contemplating this curious world, psychologically still so far away from us in the course of human evolution. The wonder and the beauty of what remains of the old Japan cannot be lessened by any knowledge of the conditions that produced them. The old kindliness and grace of manners need not cease to charm us, because we know that such manners were cultivated for 1,000 years under the edge of the sword. The common politeness which appeared but a few years ago to be almost universal, and the rarity of quarrels, should not prove less agreeable because we have learned that, for generations and generations, all quarrels among the people were punished with extraordinary rigor, and that the custom of the vendetta, which rendered necessary such repression, also made everybody cautious of word and deed. The popular smile should not seem less winning because we have been told of a period in the past of the subject classes when not to smile in the teeth of pain might cost life itself. And the Japanese woman, as cultivated by the old home training, is not less sweet a being, because she represents the moral ideal of a vanishing world, and because we can faintly surmise the cost, the incalculable cost in pain, of producing her. No, what remains of this elder civilization is full of charm unspeakable, and to witness its gradual destruction must be a grief for whomsoever has felt that charm. However intolerable may seem, to the mind of the artist or poet, those countless restrictions which once ruled all this fairy world and shaped the soul of it, he cannot but admire and love their best results. The simplicity of old custom, the amiability of manners, the daintiness of habits, the delicate tact displayed in pleasure-giving, the strange power of presenting outwardly, under any circumstances, only the best and brightest aspects of character. What emotional poetry for even the least believing in the ancient home religion, in the lamplet nightly kindled before the names of the dead, the tiny offerings of food and drink, the welcome fires lighted to guide the visiting ghosts, the little ships prepared to bear them back to the rest. And this immemorial doctrine of filial piety, exacting all that is noble, not less than all that is terrible, in duty, in gratitude, in self-denial. What strange appeal does it make to our lingering religious instincts? And how close to the divine appear to us the finer natures forged by it? What queer weird attraction in those parish temple festivals, with their happy mingling of merriment and devotion in the presence of the gods? What a universe of romance in that Buddhist art which has left its impress upon almost every product of industry, from the toy of a child to the heirloom of a prince, which has peopled the solitudes with statues, and chiseled the wayside rocks with texts of sutras. Who can forget the soft enchantment of this Buddhist atmosphere, the deep music of the great bells, the green peace of gardens haunted by fearless things, doves that flutter down at call, fishes rising to be fed? Despite our incapacity to enter into the soul life of this ancient East, despite the certainty that one might as well hope to remount the river of time and share the vanished existence of some old Greek city as to share the thoughts and the emotions of old Japan, we find ourselves bewitched forever by their vision, like those wanderers of folk-tale who rashly visited Elfland. We know that there is illusion, not as to the reality of the visible, but as to its meanings, very much illusion. Yet why should this illusion attract us, like some glimpse of paradise? Why should we feel obliged to confess the ethical glamour of a civilization as far away from us in thought as the Egypt of Ramses? Are we really charmed by the results of a social discipline that refused to recognize the individual, enamored of a cult that exacted the suppression of personality? No. The charm is made by the fact that this vision of the past represents to us much more than past or present, that it foreshadows the possibilities of some higher future in a world of perfect sympathy. After many 1,000 years there may be developed a humanity able to achieve, with never a shadow of illusion, those ethical conditions prefigured by the ideals of old Japan. Instinctive unselfishness, a common desire to find the joy of life in making happiness for others, a universal sense of moral beauty. And whenever men shall have so far gained upon the present as to need no other coach than the teaching of their own hearts, then indeed the ancient ideal of Shinto will find its supreme realization. Moreover, it should be remembered that the social state, whose results thus attract us, really produced much more than a beautiful mirage. Simple characters of great charm, though necessarily of great fixity, were developed by it in multitude. Old Japan came nearer to the achievement of the highest moral ideal than our far more evolved societies can hope to do for many 100 years. And but for those 10 centuries of war which followed upon the rise of the military power, the ethical end to which all social discipline tended might have been much more closely approached. Yet, if the better side of this human nature had been further developed, at the cost of darker and sterner qualities, the consequence might have proved unfortunate for the nation. No people so ruled by altruism as to lose its capacities for aggression and cunning could hold their own, in the present state of the world, against races hardened by the discipline of competition as well as by the discipline of war. The future Japan must rely upon the least amiable qualities of her character for success in the universal struggle, and she will need to develop them strongly. How strongly she has been able to develop them in one direction, the present war with Russia bears startling witness. But it is certainly to the long discipline of the past that she owes the moral strength behind this unexpected display of aggressive power. No superficial observation could discern the silent energies masked by the resignation of the people to change. The unconscious heroism in forming this mass of 40 million souls, the compressed force ready to expand at imperial bidding either for construction or destruction. From the leaders of a nation with such a military and political history, one might expect the manifestation of all those abilities of supreme importance in diplomacy and war, but such capacities could prove of little worth were it not for the character of the masses. The quality of the material that moves to command with the power of winds and tides. The veritable strength of Japan still lies in the moral nature of her common people, her farmers and fishers, artisans and laborers, the patient quiet folk one sees toiling in the rice fields, occupied with the humblest of crafts and callings in city byways. All the unconscious heroism of the race is in these, and all its splendid courage, a courage that does not mean indifference to life, but the desire to sacrifice life at the bidding of the imperial master, who raises the rank of the dead. From the thousands of young men now being summoned to the war, one hears no expression of hope to return to their homes with glory. The common wish uttered is only to win remembrance at the Shokunsha, that spirit-invoking temple, where the souls of all who die for emperor and fatherland are believed together. At no time was the ancient faith stronger than in this hour of struggle, and Russian power will have very much more to fear from that faith than from repeating rifles or white-head torpedoes. Note: the following reply made by Admiral Togo, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese fleet, to an imperial message of commendation received after the second attempt to block the entrance to Port Arthur, is characteristically Shinto. The warm message which Your Imperial Majesty condescended to grant us with regard to the second attempt to seal Port Arthur has not only overwhelmed us with gratitude, but may also influence the patriotic minds of the departed heroes to hover long over the battlefield and give unseen protection to the imperial forces. Translated in the Japan Times of March 31st, 1904. Such thoughts and hopes about the brave dead might have been uttered by a Greek warrior before the Battle of Salamis. The faith and courage which helped the Greeks to repel the Persian invasion were of precisely the same quality as that religious heroism which now helps the Japanese to challenge the power of Russia. End of note. Shinto as a religion of patriotism is a force that should suffice, if permitted fair play, to affect not only the destinies of the whole Far East, but the future of civilization. No more irrational assertion was ever made about the Japanese than the statement of their indifference to religion. Religion is still, as it has ever been, the very life of the people, the motive and the directing power of their every action, a religion of doing and suffering, a religion without cant and hypocrisy. And the qualities especially developed by it are just those qualities which have startled Russia, and may yet cause her many a painful surprise. She has discovered alarming force where she imagined childish weakness. She has encountered heroism where she expected to find timidity and helplessness. Note: the case of the Japanese officers and men on the transport Kinshu Maru, sank by the Russian warships on the 26th of last April, should have given the enemy matter for reflection. Although allowed an hour's time for consideration, the soldiers refused to surrender and opened fire with their rifles on the battleships. Then, before the Kinshu Maru was blown in two by a torpedo, a number of the Japanese officers and men performed harakiri. This strong display of the fierce old feudal spirit suggests how dearly a Russian success would be bought. End of note. For countless reasons, this terrible war, of which no man can yet see the end, is unspeakably to be regretted. And of these reasons not the least are industrial. War must temporarily check all tendencies towards the development of that healthy individualism without which no modern nation can become prosperous and wealthy. Enterprise is numbed, markets paralyzed, manufacturers stopped. Yet, in the extraordinary case of this extraordinary people, it is possible that the social effects of the contest will prove to some degree beneficial. Prior to hostilities, there had been a visible tendency to the premature dissolution of institutions founded upon centuries of experience, a serious likelihood of moral disintegration. That great changes must hereafter be made, that the future well-being of the country requires them, would seem to admit of no argument. But it is necessary that such changes be effected by degrees, not with such inopportune haste as to imperil the moral constitution of the nation. A war for independence, a war that obliges the race to stake its all upon the issue, must bring about a tightening of the old social bonds, and a strong quickening of the ancient sentiments of loyalty and duty, a reinforcement of conservatism. This will signify retrogression in some directions, but it will also mean invigoration in others. Before the Russian menace, the soul of Yamato revives again. Out of the contest Japan will come, if successful, morally stronger than before, and a new sense of self-confidence, a new spirit of independence, might then reveal itself in a national attitude toward foreign policy and foreign pressure. There would be, of course, the danger of overconfidence. A people able to defeat Russian power on land and sea might be tempted to believe themselves equally able to cope with foreign capital upon their own territory, and every means would certainly be tried of persuading or bullying the government into some fatal compromise on the question of the right of foreigners to hold land. Efforts in this direction have been carried on persistently and systematically for years, and these efforts seem to have received some support from a class of Japanese politicians apparently incapable of understanding what enormous tyranny a single privileged syndicate of foreign capital would be capable of exercising in such a country. It appears to me that any person comprehending, even in the vaguest way, the nature of money power and the average conditions of life throughout Japan must recognize the certainty that foreign capital with right of land tenure would find means to control legislation, to control government, and to bring about a state of affairs that would result in the practical domination of the empire by alien interests. I cannot resist the conviction that when Japan yields to foreign industry the right to purchase land, she is lost beyond hope. The self-confidence that might tempt to such yielding in view of immediate advantages would be fatal. Japan has incomparably more to fear from English or American capital than from Russian battleships and bayonets. Behind her military capacity is the disciplined experience of 1,000 years, behind her industrial and commercial power the experience of half a century. But she has been fully warned, and if she chooses hereafter to invite her own ruin, it will not have been for lack of counsel, since she had the wisest man in the world to advise her. Note: Herbert Spencer. End of note. To the reader of these pages, at least, the strength and the weakness of the new social organization, its great capacities for offensive or defensive action in military directions, and its comparative feebleness in other directions, should now be evident. All things considered, the marvel is that Japan should have been so well able to hold her own, and it was assuredly no common wisdom that guided her first unsteady efforts in new and perilous ways. Certainly, her power to accomplish what she has accomplished was derived from her old religious and social training. She was able to keep strong because, under the new forms of rule and the new conditions of social activity, she could still maintain a great deal of the ancient discipline. But even thus, it was only by the firmest and shrewdest policy that she could avert disaster, could prevent the disruption of her whole social structure under the weight of alien pressure. It was imperative that vast changes should be made, but equally imperative that they should not be of a character to endanger the foundations, and it was above all things necessary, while preparing for immediate necessities, to provide against future perils. Never before, perhaps, in the history of human civilization, did any rulers find themselves obliged to cope with problems so tremendous, so complicated, and so inexorable. And of these problems the most inexorable remains to be solved. It is furnished by the fact that although all the successes of Japan have been so far due to unselfish collective action, sustained by the old Shinto ideals of duty and obedience, her industrial future must depend upon egoistic individual action of a totally opposite kind. What then will become of the ancient morality, the ancient cult? In this moment the conditions are abnormal, But it seems certain that there will be, under normal conditions, a further gradual loosening of the old family bonds, and this would bring about a further disintegration. By the testimony of the Japanese themselves, such disintegration was spreading rapidly among the upper and middle classes of the great cities prior to the present war. Among the people of the agricultural districts and even in the country towns, the old ethical order of things has yet been little affected, and there are other influences than legislative change or social necessity which are working for disintegration. Old beliefs have been rudely shaken by the introduction of larger knowledge. A new generation is being taught in 27,000 primary schools the rudiments of science and the modern conception of the universe. The Buddhist cosmology, with its fantastic pictures of Mount Meru, has become a nursery tale. The old Chinese nature philosophy finds believers only among the little educated, or the survivors of the feudal era, and the youngest schoolboy has learned that the constellations are neither gods nor Buddhas, but far-off groups of suns. No longer can popular fancy picture the Milky Way as the river of heaven. The legend of the weaving maiden and her waiting lover and the bridge of birds is now told only to children, and the young fisherman, though steering like his fathers by the light of stars, no longer discerns in the northern sky the form of Myoken Bosatsu. Yet it were easy to misinterpret the weakening of a certain class of old beliefs, or the visible tendency to social change. Under any circumstances a religion decays slowly, and the most conservative forms of religion are the last to yield to disintegration. It were a grave mistake to suppose that the ancestor cult has yet been appreciably affected by exterior influences of any kind, or to imagine that it continues to exist merely by force of hallowed custom, and not because the majority still believe. No religion, and least of all the religion of the dead, could thus suddenly lose its hold upon the affections of the race that evolved it. Even in other directions the new skepticism is superficial. It has not spread downwards into the core of things. There is indeed a growing class of young men with whom skepticism of a certain sort is the fashion, and scorn of the past and affectation. But even among these no word of disrespect concerning the religion of the home is ever heard. Protests against the old obligations of filial piety, complaints of the growing weight of the family yoke, are sometimes uttered, but the domestic cult is never spoken of lightly. As for the communal and other public forms of Shinto, the vigor of the old religion is sufficiently indicated by the continually increasing number of temples. In 1897 there were 191,962 Shinto temples. In 1901 there were 195,256. It seems probable that such changes as must occur in the near future will be social rather than religious, and there is little reason to believe that these changes, however they may tend to weaken filial piety in sundry directions, will seriously affect the ancestor cult itself. The weight of the family bond, aggravated by the increasing difficulty and cost of life, may be more and more lightened for the individual, but no legislation can abolish the sentiment of duty to the dead. When that sentiment utterly fails, the heart of a nation will have ceased to beat. Belief in the old gods, as gods, may slowly pass, but Shinto may live on as the religion of the fatherland, a religion of heroes and patriots, and the likelihood of such future modification is indicated by the memorial character of many new temples. It has been much asserted of late years, chiefly because of the profound impression made by Mr. Percival Lowell's Soul of the Far East, that Japan is desperately in need of a gospel of individualism, and many pious persons assume that the conversion of the country to Christianity would suffice to produce the individualism. This assumption has nothing to rest on except the old superstition that national customs and habits and modes of feeling, slowly shaped in the course of thousands of years, can be suddenly transformed by a mere act of faith. Those further dissolutions of the old order, which would render possible, under normal conditions, a higher social energy, can be safely brought about through industrialism only, through the working of necessities that enforce competitive enterprise and commercial expansion. A long peace will be required for such healthy transformation, and it is not impossible that an independent and progressive Japan would then consider questions of religious change from the standpoint of political expediency. Observation and study abroad may have unduly impressed Japanese statesmen with the half-truth so forcibly uttered by Michelet, that money has a religion, that capital is Protestant, that the power and wealth and intellectual energy of the world belong to the races who cast off the yoke of Rome and freed themselves from the creed of the Middle Ages. Note: no inferences can be safely drawn from the apparent attitude of the government towards religious bodies in Japan. Of late years the seeming policy has been to encourage the less tolerant forms of Western religion. In curious contrast to this attitude is the non-toleration of Freemasonry. Strictly speaking, Freemasonry is not allowed in Japan, although, since the abolition of exterritoriality, the foreign lodges at the open ports have been permitted, or rather suffered, to exist upon certain conditions. A Japanese in Europe or America is free to become a Mason, but he cannot become a Mason in Japan, where the proceedings of all societies must remain open to official surveillance. End of note. A Japanese statesman is said to have lately declared that his countrymen were rapidly drifting towards Christianity. Newspaper reports of eminent utterances are not often trustworthy, but the report in this case is probably accurate, and the utterance intended to suggest possibilities. Since the declaration of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, there has been a remarkable softening in the attitude of safe conservatism, which the government formerly maintained toward Western religion. But as for the question whether the Japanese nation will ever adopt an alien creed under official encouragement, I think that the sociological answer is evident. Any understanding of the fundamental structure of society should make equally obvious the imprudence of attempting hasty transformations, and the impossibility of effecting them. For the present, at least, the religious question in Japan is a question of social integrity, and any efforts to precipitate the natural course of change can result only in provoking reaction and disorder. I believe that the time is far away at which Japan can venture to abandon the policy of caution that has served her so well. I believe that the day on which she adopts a Western creed, her immemorial dynasty is doomed, and I cannot help fearing that whenever she yields to foreign capital the right to hold so much as one rood of her soil, she signs away her birthright beyond hope of recovery. With a few general remarks upon the religion of the Far East in its relation to Occidental aggressions, this attempt at interpretation may fitly conclude. All the societies of the Far East are founded, like that of Japan, upon ancestor worship. This ancient religion, in various forms, represents their moral experience, and it offers everywhere, to the introduction of Christianity as now intolerantly preached, obstacles of the most serious kind. Attacks upon it must seem, to those whose lives are directed by it, the greatest of outrages and the most unpardonable of crimes. A religion for which every member of a community believes it his duty to die at call is a religion for which he will fight. His patience with attacks upon it will depend upon the degree of his intelligence and the nature of his training. All the races of the Far East have not the intelligence of the Japanese, nor have they been equally well trained, under ages of military discipline, to adapt their conduct to circumstances. For the Chinese peasant, in especial, attacks upon his religion are intolerable. His cult remains the most precious of his possessions, and his supreme guide in all matters of social right and wrong. The East has been tolerant of all creeds which do not assault the foundations of its societies. And if Western missions had been wise enough to leave those foundations alone, to deal with the ancestor cult, as Buddhism did, and to show the same spirit of tolerance in other directions, the introduction of Christianity upon a very extensive scale should have proved a matter of no difficulty. That the result would have been a Christianity differing considerably from Western Christianity is obvious. The structure of Far Eastern society not admitting of sudden transformations. But the essentials of doctrine might have been widely propagated, without exciting social antagonism, much less race-hatred. Today it is probably impossible to undo what the sterile labor of intolerance has already done. The hatred of Western religion in China and adjacent countries is undoubtedly due to the needless and implacable attacks which have been made upon the ancestor cult. To demand of a Chinese or an enemy's that he cast away or destroy his ancestral tablets is not less irrational and inhumane than it would be to demand of an Englishman or a Frenchman that he destroy his mother's tombstone in proof of his devotion to Christianity. Nay, it is much more inhumane, for the European attaches to the funeral monument no such idea of sacredness as that which attaches, in Eastern belief, to the simple tablet inscribed with the name of the dead parent. From old time these attacks upon the domestic faith of docile and peaceful communities have provoked massacres, and, if persisted in, they will continue to provoke massacres, while the people have strength left to strike. How foreign religious aggression is answered by native religious aggression, and how Christian military power avenges the foreign victims with tenfold slaughter and strong robbery, need not here be recorded. It has not been in these years only that ancestor-worshipping peoples have been slaughtered, impoverished, or subjugated in revenge for the uprisings that missionary intolerance provokes. But while Western trade and commerce directly gain by these revenges, Western public opinion will suffer no discussion of the right of provocation or the justice of retaliation. The less tolerant religious bodies call it a wickedness even to raise the question of moral right, and against the impartial observer who dares to lift his voice in protest, fanaticism turns as ferociously as if he were proved an enemy of the human race. From the sociological point of view, the whole missionary system, irrespective of sect and creed, represents the skirmishing force of Western civilization in its general attack upon all civilizations of the ancient type, the first line in the forward movement of the strongest and most highly evolved societies upon the weaker and less evolved. The conscious work of these fighters is that of preachers and teachers. The unconscious work is that of sappers and destroyers. The subjugation of weak races has been aided by their work to a degree little imagined, and by no other conceivable means could it have been accomplished so quickly and so surely. For destruction they labor unknowingly, like a force of nature. Yet Christianity does not appreciably expand. They perish, and they really lay down their lives, with more than the courage of soldiers, not, as they hope, to assist the spread of the doctrine which the East must still of necessity refuse, but to help industrial enterprise and Occidental aggrandizement. The real and avowed object of missions is defeated by persistent indifference to sociological truths, and the martyrdoms and sacrifices are utilized by Christian nations for ends essentially opposed to the spirit of Christianity. Needless to say that the aggressions of race upon race are fully in accord with the universal law of struggle, that perpetual struggle in which only the more capable survive. Inferior races must become subservient to higher races, or disappear before them. And ancient types of civilization, too rigid for progress, must yield to the pressure of more efficient and more complex civilizations. The law is pitiless and plain. Its operations may be mercifully modified, but never prevented, by human consideration. Yet, for no generous thinker can the ethical questions involved be thus easily settled. We are not justified in holding that the inevitable is morally ordained, much less that, because the higher races happen to be on the winning side in the world struggle, might can ever constitute right. Human progress has been achieved by denying the law of the stronger, by battling against those impulses to crush the weak, to prey upon the helpless, which rule in the world of the brute, and are no less in accord with the natural order than are the courses of the stars. All virtues and restraints making civilization possible have been developed in the teeth of natural law. Those races which lead are the races who first learned that the highest power is acquired by the exercise of forbearance, and that liberty is best maintained by the protection of the weak and by the strong repression of injustice. Unless we be ready to deny the whole of the moral experience thus gained, unless we are willing to assert that the religion in which it has been expressed is only the creed of a particular civilization, and not the religion of humanity, it were difficult to imagine any ethical justification for the aggressions made upon alien peoples in the name of Christianity and enlightenment. Certainly the results in China of such aggression have not been Christianity nor enlightenment, but revolts, massacres, detestable cruelties, the destruction of cities, the devastation of provinces, the loss of tens of thousands of lives, the extortion of hundreds of millions of money. If all this be right, then might is might indeed. And our professed religion of humanity and justice is proved to be as exclusive as any primitive cult, and intended to regulate conduct only as between members of the same society. But to the evolutionist, at least, the matter appears in a very different light. The plain teaching of sociology is that the higher races cannot with impunity cast aside their moral experience in dealing with feebler races, and that Western civilization will have to pay, sooner or later, the full penalty of its deeds of repression. Nations that, while refusing to endure religious intolerance at home, steadily maintain religious intolerance abroad, must eventually lose those rights of intellectual freedom which cost so many centuries of atrocious struggle to win. Perhaps the period of the penalty is not very far away. With the return of all Europe to militant conditions, there has set in a vast ecclesiastical revival of which the menace to human liberty is unmistakable. The spirit of the Middle Ages threatens to prevail again, and anti-Semitism has actually become a factor in the politics of 3 continental powers. It has been well said that no man can estimate the force of a religious conviction until he has tried to oppose it. Probably no man can imagine the wicked side of convention upon the subject of missions until the masked batteries of its malevolence have been trained against him. Yet the question of mission policy cannot be answered either by secret slander or by public abuse of the person raising it. Today it has become a question that concerns the peace of the world, the future of commerce, and the interest of civilization. The integrity of China depends upon it, and the present war is not foreign to it. Perhaps this book, in spite of many shortcomings, will not fail to convince some thoughtful persons that the constitution of Far Eastern society presents insuperable obstacles to the propaganda of Western religion as hitherto conducted. That these obstacles now demand, more than at any previous epoch, the most careful and human consideration, and that the further needless maintenance of an uncompromising attitude towards them can result in nothing but evil. Whatever the religion of ancestors may have been thousands of years ago, today Throughout the Far East it is the religion of family affection and duty, and by inhumanly ignoring this fact, Western zealots can scarcely fail to provoke a few more Boxer uprisings. The real power to force upon the world a peril from China, now that the chance seems lost for Russia, should not be suffered to rest with those who demand religious tolerance for the purpose of preaching intolerance. Never will the East turn Christian while dogmatism requires the convert to deny his ancient obligation to the family, the community, and the government, and further insists that he prove his zeal for an alien creed by destroying the tablets of his ancestors and outraging the memory of those who gave him life. End of chapter 23. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 24 of Japan, an attempted interpretation by Lafcadio Hearn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix. Herbert Spencer's advice to Japan. Some 5 years ago, I was told by an American professor, then residing in Tokyo, that after Herbert Spencer's death there would be published a letter of advice, which the philosopher had addressed to a Japanese statesman concerning the policy by which the empire might be able to preserve its independence. I was not able to obtain any further information, but I felt tolerably sure, remembering the statement regarding Japanese social disintegration in First Principles, section 178, that the advice would prove to have been of the most conservative kind. As a matter of fact, it was even more conservative than I had imagined. Herbert Spencer died on the morning of December 8th, 1903, while this book was in course of preparation, and the letter addressed to Baron Kaneko Kentaro, under circumstances with which the public have already been made familiar, was published in the London Times of January 18th, 1904. Fairfield, Pusey, Wilts, August 26th, 1892. My dear Sir, your proposal to send translations of my 2 letters to Count Ito, the newly appointed Prime Minister, is quite satisfactory. I very willingly give my assent. Note: these letters have not as yet been made public. End of note. Respecting the further questions you ask, let me, in the first place, answer generally that the Japanese policy should, I think, be that of keeping Americans and Europeans as much as possible at arm's length. In presence of the more powerful races, your position is one of chronic danger, and you should take every precaution to give as little foothold as possible to foreigners. It seems to me that the only forms of intercourse which you may with advantage permit are those which are indispensable for the exchange of commodities, importation and exportation of physical and mental products. No further privileges should be allowed to people of other races, and especially to people of the more powerful races, than is absolutely needful for the achievement of these ends. Apparently you are proposing by revision of the treaty with the powers of Europe and America to open the whole empire to foreigners and foreign capital. I regret this as a fatal policy. If you wish to see what is likely to happen, study the history of India. Once let one of the more powerful races gain a point d'appui, and there will inevitably, in course of time, grow up an aggressive policy which will lead to collisions with the Japanese. These collisions will be represented as attacks by the Japanese, which must be avenged, as the case may be. A portion of territory will be seized and required to be made over as a foreign settlement, and from this there will grow eventually subjugation of the entire Japanese empire. I believe that you will have great difficulty in avoiding this fate in any case, but you will make the process easy if you allow of any privileges to foreigners beyond those which I have indicated. In pursuance of the advice thus generally indicated, I should say, in answer to your first question, that there should be not only a prohibition of foreign persons to hold property in land, but also a refusal to give them leases, and a permission only to reside as annual tenants.
To the second question I should say decidedly prohibit to foreigners the working of the mines owned or worked by government. Here there would be obviously liable to arise grounds of difference between the Europeans or Americans who work them and the government, and these grounds of quarrel would be followed by invocations to the English or American governments or other powers to send forces to insist on whatever the European workers claimed, for always the habit here and elsewhere among the civilized peoples is to believe what their agents or sellers abroad represent to them. In the third place, in pursuance of the policy I have indicated, you ought also to keep the coasting trade in your own hands, and forbid foreigners to engage in it. Is clearly not included in the requirement I have indicated as the sole one to be recognized, a requirement to facilitate exportation and importation of commodities. The distribution of commodities brought to Japan from other places may be properly left to the Japanese themselves, and should be denied to foreigners, for the reason that again the various transactions involved would become so many doors open to quarrels and resulting aggressions. To your remaining question respecting the intermarriage of foreigners and Japanese, which you say is now very much agitated among our scholars and politicians, and which you say is one of the most difficult problems, my reply is that, as rationally answered, there is no difficulty at all. It should be positively forbidden. It is not at root a question of social philosophy, it is at root a question of biology. There is abundant proof, alike furnished by the intermarriages of human races and by the interbreeding of animals, that when the varieties mingled diverge beyond a certain slight degree, the result is inevitably a bad one in the long run. I have myself been in the habit of looking at the evidence bearing on this matter for many years past, and my conviction is based on numerous facts derived from numerous sources. This conviction I have within the last half-hour verified, for I happen to be staying in the country with a gentleman who is well known and has had much experience respecting the interbreeding of cattle, and he has just, on inquiry, fully confirmed my belief that when, say, of the different varieties of sheep, there is an interbreeding of those which are widely unlike, the result, especially in the second generation, is a bad one. There arise an incalculable mixture of traits, and what may be called a chaotic constitution. And the same thing happens among human beings. The Eurasians in India, the half-breeds in America, show this. The physiological basis of this experience appears to be that any one variety of creature, in course of many generations, acquires a certain constitutional adaptation to its particular form of life, and every other variety similarly acquires its own special adaptation. The consequence is that, if you mix the constitution of two widely divergent varieties, which have severally become adapted to widely divergent modes of life, you get a constitution which is adapted to the mode of life of neither. A constitution which will not work properly, because it is not fitted for any set of conditions whatever. By all means, therefore, peremptorily interdict marriages of Japanese with foreigners. I have for the reasons indicated entirely approved of the regulations which have been established in America for restraining the Chinese immigration, and had I the power, I would restrict them to the smallest possible amount, my reasons for this decision being that one of two things must happen. If the Chinese are allowed to settle extensively in America, they must either, if they remain unmixed, form a subject race standing in the position, if not of slaves, yet of a class approaching to slaves, or if they mix, they must form a bad hybrid. In either case, supposing the immigration to be large, immense social mischief must arise, and eventually social disorganization. The same thing will happen if there should be any considerable mixture of European or American races with the Japanese. You see, therefore, that my advice is strongly conservative in all directions, and I end by saying, as I began, keep other races at arm's length as much as possible. I give this advice in confidence. I wish that it should not transpire publicly, at any rate during my life, for I do not desire to rouse the animosity of my fellow countrymen. I am sincerely yours, Herbert Spencer. Postscript. Of course, when I say I wish the advice to be in confidence, I do not interdict the communication of it to Count Ito, but rather wish that he should have the opportunity of taking it into consideration. How fairly Herbert Spencer understood the prejudices of his countrymen has been shown by the comments of the Times upon his letter, comments chiefly characterized by that unreasoning quality of abuse with which the English conventional mind commonly resents the pain of a new idea opposed to immediate interests. Yet some knowledge of the real facts in the case should serve to convince even the Times that if Japan is able in this moment to fight for the cause of civilization in general, and for English interests in particular, it is precisely because the Japanese statesmen of a wiser generation maintained a sound conservative policy upon the very lines indicated in that letter, so unjustly called a proof of colossal egotism. Whether the advice itself directly served at any time to influence government policy, I do not know, but that it fully accorded with the national instinct of self-preservation is shown by the history of that fierce opposition which the advocates of the abolition of extraterritoriality had to encounter, and by the nature of the precautionary legislation enacted in regard to those very matters dwelt upon in Herbert Spencer's letter. Though extraterritoriality has been, unavoidably perhaps, abolished, foreign capital has not been left free to exploit the resources of the country, and foreigners are not allowed to own land. Though marriages between Japanese and foreigners have never been forbidden, they have never been encouraged, and can take place only under special legal restrictions. Note: the number of families in Tokyo representing such unions is said to be over 100. End of note. If foreigners could have acquired, through marriage, the right to hold Japanese real estate, a considerable amount of such estate would soon have passed into alien hands. But the law has wisely provided that the Japanese woman, marrying a foreigner, thereby becomes a foreigner, and that the children by such a marriage remain foreigners. On the other hand, any foreigner adopted by marriage into a Japanese family becomes a Japanese, and the children in such event remain Japanese. But they also remain under certain disabilities. They are precluded from holding high offices of state, and they cannot even become officers of the army or navy except by special permission. This permission appears to have been accorded in 1 or 2 cases. Finally, it is to be observed that Japan has kept her coasting trade in her own hands. On the whole, then, it may be said that Japanese policy followed to a considerable extent the course suggested in Herbert Spencer's letter of advice, and it is much to be regretted, in my humble opinion, that the advice could not have been followed more closely. Could the philosopher have lived to hear of the recent Japanese victories, the defeat of a powerful Russian fleet without the loss of a single Japanese vessel, and the rout of 30,000 Russian troops on the Yalu, I do not think that he would have changed his counsel by a hair's breadth. Perhaps he would have commented, so far as his humanitarian conscience permitted, the thoroughness of the Japanese study of the new science of war. He might have praised the high courage displayed, and the triumph of the ancient discipline. His sympathies would have been on the side of the country compelled to choose between the necessities of inviting a protectorate or fighting Russia. But had he been questioned again as to the policy of the future in case of victory, he would probably have reminded the questioner that military efficiency is a very different thing from industrial power, and have vigorously repeated his warning. Understanding the structure and the history of Japanese society, he could clearly perceive the dangers of foreign contact, and the directions from which attempts to take advantage of the industrial weakness of the country were likely to be made. In another generation, Japan will be able, without peril, to abandon much of her conservatism, but, for the time being, her conservatism is her salvation. End of chapter 24. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. End of Japan, an attempt at interpretation by Lafcadio Hearn.